There came a moment in my 50s when I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't fully recognize the woman staring back. Not because I'd aged, but because I'd stretched, twisted, and molded myself into what everyone else needed me to be. I had spent years saying yes when I wanted to say no, biting my tongue when I had something powerful to say, showing up for people who wouldn't walk across the street from me, all in the name of keeping the peace, being liked, being the good one, being the dependable one. I was exhausted. Pleasing people had become a full-time job, and let me tell you, it didn't come with a paycheck, a thank you note, or a peace of mind. And the deeper I got into it, the more I realized that no matter how much I gave, how much I showed up, or how much of myself I sacrificed, it was never enough. Someone was always upset. Someone always had expectations I hadn't met. Someone always wanted more. And there I was, last on my own list. So I had to ask myself, what do I get from being a people pleaser? Approval, validation, temporary acceptance. And what do I lose? Time, energy, self-respect, authenticity. And that's when the shift began. I stopped saying yes just to avoid conflict. I stopped agreeing just to keep someone from being disappointed. I stopped volunteering for roles I didn't want to play in people's lives, roles they assigned to me without asking if I even wanted them. I started giving myself permission to disappoint people if it meant not disappointing myself. Because people who truly love you won't need you to shrink, twist, or lie to be accepted. I learned that I am not responsible for how others feel about me. I am only responsible for being true to who I am. And if that means being too direct for some, too quiet for others, too bold for the rest, so be it. I refuse to spend the rest of my life editing myself to make others feel comfortable. I used to think that keeping everyone happy was love, but it was fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, but the truth is, the right people in your life don't need you to perform, they need you to be real. And when I let go of the constant need to please, I created space for deeper, more honest relationships. Ones that didn't demand a version of me that was always tired, always giving, always erasing herself to belong. I quit trying to please everyone, not because I stopped caring, but because I finally started caring about me. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from saying yes when everything inside you is screaming no. And for most of my life, I wore that exhaustion like a badge of honor. I thought it made me kind, thought it made me reliable, thought it made me a good person. But the truth is, it made me resentful, depleted, and distant from my own truth. I can't even count the number of times I agreed to things that didn't feel right in my body. Dinners I didn't want to attend, projects I didn't have the bandwidth for, conversations I wasn't emotionally ready to have, commitments that I knew will drain me before they even began. But I said yes anyway because I didn't want to disappoint anyone. I didn't want to be seen as selfish or unreliable. I didn't want people to think I didn't care. But here's the thing. Every time I said yes when I meant no, I abandoned myself. I put someone else's comfort above my own peace, and the cost of that was steep. I carried silent resentment. I felt bitter. I showed up half-heartedly, which wasn't fair to anyone involved, least of all me. What I didn't realize for a long time is that every yes is a promise. It's not just a word. It's a piece of your time, your energy, your life, and when you hand it out carelessly, you end up with nothing left for yourself. I had to learn the difference between being generous and being self-sacrificing, between being kind and being dishonest. Because saying yes when you mean no is a lie, a soft, socially accepted lie, but a lie nonetheless. And it eats away at your authenticity. It took time and a lot of uncomfortable moments to finally start honoring my no, to say it clearly without guilt, without over-explaining, without apologizing, and believe me, at first it felt unnatural. I'd say no, and immediately feel the need to soften it, to explain myself, to offer an alternative. But the more I practiced, the more I realized that no is a complete sentence. It doesn't need a story. It doesn't require permission. I started to realize that people who truly value me will respect my boundaries. They won't guilt me for protecting my energy. They won't withdraw love just because I didn't comply. And if they do, if my no of them more than my self-neglect ever did, then they were never really for me in the first place. Also had to unlearn the fear that saying no would make me unlovable, that people would leave, that they'd think less of me. What I found instead was that people began to trust me more, because when I say yes now, they know I mean it. They know It's not a performance. They know I'm not just going through the motions. My yes became sacred because my no became honest. There's a quiet kind of power in choosing yourself, in honoring what your spirit is telling you, in protecting your inner space from what drains and depletes you, and it all begins the moment you stop saying yes out of obligation and start saying no from a place of truth. For the longest time, I carried a belief deep in my bones that rest had to be earned, that unless I was running, grinding, pushing, or producing, I hadn't done enough to deserve stillness, and even when I did rest, I couldn't enjoy it. I'd sit down with a cup of tea and a heavy conscience. I'd lay in bed on a Sunday morning and hear a voice in my head listing all the things I should be doing. That voice wasn't gentle. It was judgmental, and it followed me everywhere. I used to believe that productivity was proof of my worth, that the more exhausted I was, the more valuable I became. I thought hustle was the language of success. I thought sleep was for the lazy. I thought slowing down was a weakness. And so I kept going even when I was mentally afraid, even when my body was aching, even when I knew deep down that I was running on fumes. But over time, I began to see how much damage that mindset caused. I wasn't just tired, I was disconnected from my joy, disconnected from the present moment, disconnected from myself. I was constantly doing, but rarely being. I had no idea how to just sit and be at peace with nothing on the schedule. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, completely burnt out, tears welling in my eyes, asking, why do I feel so guilty for needing rest? And the answer came gently but honestly, because you were taught that your worth is in your work, not in your wellness. That realization hit me like a wave. I had internalized a culture that glamorized burnout, that praised being booked and busy over being balanced and well. I had bought into the lie that if I wasn't pushing myself to the edge, I wasn't doing enough. But rest is not a weakness. It is not laziness. It is not a luxury reserved for when everything is done. Because guess what? Everything is never done. The to-do list never ends. And if I waited for the world to give me permission to rest, I would never ever receive it. So, I had to give myself that permission. I had to reframe how I saw rest, not as an interruption, but as an investment, not as a pause from productivity, but as a part of it. I began to understand that when I rested, I wasn't doing nothing. I was healing, I was resetting, I was reconnecting, and I was becoming more capable of showing up fully when it was time to move again. But the guilt didn't disappear overnight. It showed up often, whispering lies like, you're falling behind, or other people are doing more than you. But I learned to silence that voice with truth. I am allowed to rest. I am allowed to breathe. I am allowed to just exist without performing for anyone's expectations, including my own. I started reclaiming small pockets of rest. I let myself nap without shame. I took slow walks with no destination. I watched the sun set without reaching for my phone. I began to honor my body when it said not today. And I didn't argue with it. I listened, because what I discovered is that rest isn't selfish, it's sacred, and we don't need to break down to justify it. We don't need to be on the brink of collapse to finally allow ourselves softness. We are allowed to choose ease, quiet, slowness. We are allowed to prioritize our well-being before the world demands it. There was a time in my life too long, if I'm honest, when I edited myself before I even spoke. I toned down my opinions to avoid sounding too much. I'd watered down my passion so I wouldn't come across as intimidating. I'd shrink my light just enough so no one else would feel uncomfortable standing next to me. I made myself smaller to fit into rooms I had every right to take up space in. And for what? Approval, acceptance, temporary peace that never lasted. I was taught directly and indirectly that being soft-spoken was polite, that being agreeable was attractive, and that being bold was somehow too aggressive. So, I said sorry when I spoke too loudly. I said sorry when I took up space. I said sorry when I succeeded, when I felt confident, even when I simply existed in my truth. My apologies weren't always verbal, but they were there in the way I held back, in the way I dimmed my shine, in the way I second-guessed my intuition. But the truth is, every time I apologized for who I was, I sent a message to myself: you are not enough as you are. And that message settled deep into my bones. It shaped how I moved through the world. It made me question my instincts. It made me tolerate things I should have walked away from. It made me accept relationships jobs, and environments that were never aligned with my spirit. And then one day I woke up tired, not just physically but emotionally, tired of performing, tired of explaining, tired of filtering, tired of giving people the edited version of me so they could feel comfortable. That kind of tired doesn't come from the body, it comes from the soul. And I knew if I didn't stop apologizing for who I was, I would never feel truly free. So I started doing the work. I started noticing all the ways I'd been conditioned to say, "I'm sorry," when what I really meant was, "Thank you for your patience," or "I deserve to be here," or simply, "No, I will not make myself smaller." I started unlearning the belief that confidence is arrogance. I started reclaiming my voice, the one that didn't shake when I spoke my truth, the one that didn't need to be sugar-coated or approved by anyone else. And you know what I found on the other side of all that apologizing? Power. Not loud, performative power, but quiet, grounded, unshakable power. The kind that comes from standing fully in your own skin without guilt or shame. The kind that says, "This is who I am, and I don't need to explain it." I discovered that people will adjust, and if they don't, that's not my burden to carry. I stopped saying sorry for being emotional. I stopped saying sorry for being driven. I stopped saying sorry for being joyful when others weren't. I stopped saying sorry for my boundaries, my voice, my growth, my softness, my strength. I stopped apologizing for taking care of myself, for speaking when I had something to say, and for being a woman who knows exactly who she is. And maybe the most powerful shift of all, I stopped apologizing in my mind. I stopped that internal dialogue that constantly asked, "Is this too much?" and replaced it with, "Is this true to who I am?" Because at the end of the day, the world doesn't need a quieter, dimmer, edited version of me. It needs the real one, the full one, the one who walks in with her head high, her heart open, and no apology in sight. There's a certain kind of heaviness that doesn't belong to you, but you carry it anyway, and after a while, it starts to feel normal, like it's your responsibility to hold everyone together, to be the one who listens, absorbs, fixes, and stays strong when others fall apart. I lived a big part of my life that way, shouldering the weight of other people's choices, mistakes, heartbreaks, and trauma, all while quietly ignoring the toll it was taking on me. I thought love meant carrying their burden. I thought being a good friend, a good daughter, a good partner meant stepping into people's darkness and sitting there with them until they could find the light. But somewhere along the way, I started mistaking compassion for codependency. I started believing it was my job to heal wounds I didn't create. I blurred the line between empathy and self-sacrifice, between helping and enabling. And you know what happens when you carry pain that isn't yours for too long. You begin to lose touch with your own emotions. You can't tell where your feelings end and theirs begin. You feel drained without knowing why. You cry tears that don't even belong to you. You walk through life with a heaviness that was never meant to be yours to bear. I found myself constantly overextending, taking on other people's sadness, feeling responsible for their healing, saying I'm okay when I wasn't, just so I could be the one who stayed strong for someone else. I was always the shoulder to cry on, the safe place, the anchor, but I had no place to rest myself. No one asked how I was really doing because I had trained everyone to believe I was always fine. But deep down I was exhausted. I had to learn slowly and painfully that there's a difference between holding space and holding someone else's pain as if it were your own. You can love someone and still set boundaries. You can care deeply without collapsing under the weight of their emotions. You can sit with someone in their struggle without making their struggle your identity. I began to understand that healing is an inside job. No matter how much you love someone, you cannot rescue them from the work they must do for themselves. You cannot bleed for people who won't stop their own wounds from reopening. You cannot be their solution if they're not willing to choose change. And the more you try, the more they lean on you, instead of leaning into their own growth. So I started stepping back, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. I stopped rushing to solve everything. I stopped interrupting their process with my advice, my energy, my emotional labor. I began saying things like, "I hear you," instead of, "Let me fix this." I began honoring my own limits, not as a punishment to others, but as a commitment to myself, and it wasn't easy. I had to sit with the discomfort of not jumping in. I had to learn how to hold compassion in one hand and self-protection in the other. I had to grieve the roles I played for so long, the helper, the savior, the one who always showed up even when I was unraveling on the inside. But as I started laying those burdens down, I could finally feel the lightness of my own spirit again. I could hear my own thoughts, feel my own emotions, and tend to my own heart without everyone else's weight on my back. I realized that the most powerful kind of love isn't about saving anyone. It's about standing beside them while still standing fully in your truth. For so many years, I measured my life through a lens that didn't belong to me. I looked left and right, constantly watching what everyone else was doing, how fast they were moving, how far they'd come, what they had accomplished, who they had beside them. I tracked their milestones like they were deadlines for my own life, and in doing that, I stopped honoring my path. Comparison crept in quietly at first. It would show up in casual conversations, scrolling through pictures, hearing someone else's good news. I'd smile on the outside, but inside I'd feel that sting, that whisper. Why are you not there yet? What's wrong with you? How are they doing it? Better, faster, easier. Didn't matter what I had achieved because someone was always doing more. Someone was always younger, more successful, more visible, more loved. And instead of celebrating their growth, I turned it into a silent punishment for myself. I didn't even realize I was building a prison in my own mind, one that said I had to match someone else's pace to feel worthy. But life doesn't work like that. We are not on a racetrack, we're on a journey. And the moment I started comparing my road to someone else's, I lost sight of the beauty in mine. I had to sit down with myself and ask the hard question, why do you keep looking at their path instead of your own? And the answer was simple. Because I didn't fully trust that mine was enough. I didn't trust that even if it looked different, it was still divine. I didn't believe that slow was still progress, that rest was still sacred, that healing took time, and that everything was unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. Comparison doesn't inspire growth, it suffocates it. It makes you rush what needs to be nurtured. It makes you resent the very lessons that are shaping you into the person you're meant to become. I had to unlearn the belief that someone else's win was my loss. I had to remind myself over and over that their timing is not my timing. Their blessings are not a threat to mine. So I started shifting my focus. I started paying attention to the quiet wins in my own life, the internal growth, the emotional strength, the small steps forward that no one claps for. I stopped keeping score. I stopped watching the clock. I began to measure success by how at peace I felt with who I was becoming, not by how impressive my life looked to anyone else. And the more I did that, the more I realized how unfair I had been to myself. I was holding my life up to standards that weren't mine. I was rushing a process that needed space. I was comparing my middle to someone else's highlight reel, not seeing the years of work, pain, or struggle behind their story. I was romanticizing their finish line and forgetting the battles they never posted, the doubts they never voiced, the breakdowns that came before the breakthroughs. We all walk different roads. Some take longer, some twist, some rise, some fall, but all of them are valid, all of them matter, and none of them are wrong. I began to celebrate people from a place of wholeness, not lack. I started to truly believe that someone else's light doesn't dim mine, that someone else arriving early doesn't mean I'm late, that there's no one right path to fulfillment, only the one that feels true to your soul. And when I stopped comparing, I could finally breathe in the rhythm of my own journey. I could move without pressure. I could grow without shame. I could be proud of my pace. I could show up not to match anyone, but to honor myself fully, deeply, and with grace. When I look back, I don't see regret. I see release. I see a woman who finally stopped carrying what was never hers to hold. A woman who stopped running toward everyone else's definition of happiness and finally stood still long enough to hear her own. The joy I feel today in my 60s didn't come from adding more. It came from letting go of guilt, of comparison, of people-pleasing, of emotional baggage that wore me down for far too long. You don't become lighter by chasing more. You become lighter by choosing what no longer belongs to you. And when you choose yourself unapologetically, consistently, and with love, you don't just age, you rise.